Defense counsel for accused number 3, Advocate Charles Mnisi, shares scenarios presented by previous witnesses and then asks Dr. Steenkamp, based on his findings, if it is possible for the bullet to be fired from an angle of depression. The doctor responds with a no. Welcome to my channel, crime enthusiasts. Please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell button and comment. Thank you. Now let's watch.
Is it the court, my lord? Good day, Doc.
Good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon, Doc. Thank you, Doc. I'm going to try and paint a scenario that was given by the state witnesses who testified, eyewitnesses who testified about how possibly the incident might have had happened in the house. I will do that with a view to try and give you just a bit of a background. Then we come and speak about your possible findings on the fact that the firearm was most probably fired from an angle of depression. Do you understand? Thank you. Now, according to the eyewitnesses, well, there are two versions, but I'll explain them to you. One side of the story is that just a bit of a background. According to the state witnesses, there are two people who got into the house whilst they were seated in the sitting room, one of which had a firearm. The other one did not have a firearm in his possession. Now, the one who had a firearm gave some instruction that he wanted money and cell phones. One of the occupants of the house stood up and accosted the gentleman who had a firearm, pushed him aside, and then he dashed out of the house. That's when then the rest of the occupants of the house also stood up, and a commotion then happened. They accosted the two people, the intruders. We prefer to call them intruders here, got up to the kitchen area. That is generally the bit of a background. Now, one version from the eyewitnesses who were in the house is that the deceased then was in a tussle or was fighting with the person who had a firearm. That's now one of the versions. And as they were fighting, the person who had a firearm has had his back on the kitchen door, as you're looking at photo number 15. In other words, the firearm person, or the person who was in possession of the firearm, was leaning on the kitchen door as the deceased was facing him. Do you follow? Now, there was a shot that went off, and everybody started to run away. There's basically no indication that somebody said, no, I saw how the shot was fired. It was just a shot that went off as the deceased and the person with the firearm were fighting for the firearm. Now, I know you might know we are not a ballistic expert, but on the basis of that first scenario, when you look at photo number 15, those are the markings where the bullet struck the door as well. Would you say that accords with the explanation taking into account that the deceased was on the other side of the door. He was not leaning on the door. It was actually the person who had a firearm who was on the door. Would you say that accords with the factual explanation as presented to this court? And also the fact that according to your finding, the bullet was fired from an angle of depression.
No, that would not make sense.
Ngendlela ke oyichaza ngayo ngoba ke ummeli umchazele indlela ke echaziwe ofakazi ukuthi ke lo owayephethe isibhamu wayencike esicabheni uma ufike yena ke engaphakathi ke endlini ebheke kuyena kodwa udokotela mayiphendula ke uthi ngalendlela oyichaza ngayo ke angeke ke ayihlangani ke ngalendlela oyichaza ngayo.
Thank you. Now, that was just the first scenario that was given to this court by the state witnesses. Now, the second scenario is one of the witnesses also testified that as the skirmishness was happening in the kitchen, the deceased was in a tussle or was fighting with the person who did not have a firearm, and that fighting was taking place at that door area. Do you follow? As and when the person who did not have a firearm was fighting with the deceased at that door area, the person who had a firearm was behind the deceased. Do you also follow? Now, again, in view of your explanation that the shot, in view of your analysis and your conclusion that a shot could have been fired from an angle of depression, does the second scenario also accord with your finding?
Do I understand you correctly? Is that this scenario implies that the deceased was shot from the back? Do I understand you correctly?
I did not get that, Doc. You're a bit low.
Do I understand you correctly?
Yes.
If the scenario that you have described implies that the deceased was shot from the back, so the entrance wound would have been at his back. Do I understand you correctly?
I'm not implying anything. I'm only trying to give you the facts that were presented to this court. In terms of the second scenario, the person who had a firearm being at the back of the deceased. Now, in terms of your finding, is that the entry wound is on the sternum, is on the front chest, and the exit wound is at the back. Now, the witness says the deceased was in a tussle with a person. This is just a repetition. Was in a tussle with a person who did not have the firearm, but the person who had a firearm was at the back of the deceased. Now your findings are saying the entry wound was in the front, the exit wound was in the back, and more so, from your analysis of the wound, is that the bullet could have been fired from an angle of depression. Just your opinion. Does that accord with your findings?
No, it does not, no.
Lokhu kokuthi ke umufike wayelwisana nomuntu ke owayengaphethe isibhamu bese kuukuthi lo wayephethe isibhamu wayengasemuva kwakhe ke umufi kwase lokho ke akuhlangani ke naloku mina ke engikutholile uma ngaba sengihlola ke ngibheka wona ke umzimba wakhe umufi akuhlangani ke ukuthi lo wayephethe isibhamu wayengasemuva kwakhe.
Thank you, Doc. I had so many questions, but I realized that most of them relate to ballistic expertise, and you're a pathologist. You dissect bodies when they come there to identify the causes of death, not so. Thank you, Doc. I don't think I've got any further questions to you. Thank you, Doc. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks for watching, fellow crime enthusiasts.